In 30 years on the bench, no one dared to challenge him until a White House advisor walked in wearing a cross ring. He fined her $5,000, but minutes later, he was the one forced to back down. What could flip the scales of justice so fast? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the courthouse doors, her heels echoing in the tense, crowded space. The usual noise of minor cases, the clatter of keyboards, the shuffle of papers, felt different today, heavier. The room was packed with people waiting for their turn, each face a mix of anxiety and impatience. But Jasmine's focus was sharp, her mind already racing through the events of the past hour. Just before she had left the White House, the phone rang, a call from none other than President Donald Trump. "Jasmine," his voice came through, urgent and direct. "We need you at the D.C. courthouse. There's a case about religious freedom, a group of Christians suing to pray in public. It's bigger than just them. We can't afford to lose this." The moment she hung up, the weight of the responsibility hit her. This wasn't just another assignment. It was a fight for something deeper, something personal. Without a moment's hesitation, she grabbed her things, slipping the silver cross ring onto her finger. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was her belief, her conviction, a quiet symbol of the battle she was about to walk into. Now, walking into this courtroom, she knew the stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about observing a case. It was a battle for rights that could shape the future of the nation. The air inside was thick with tension, and as her eyes scanned the room, Jasmine steeled herself for what was to come. She wasn't just a representative of the White House. Today, she was standing for something far more significant: freedom. Jasmine slid into the middle row of the courtroom, her back straight and focused. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, but she pushed it aside, ready for the task ahead. She was here on the president's orders to witness a case that could change the course of justice. The room buzzed with the usual hum of minor cases and trivial disputes. She opened her notebook, poised to capture every detail. Yet something in the air felt off, like the calm before a storm. Today, she was no longer just an observer. She was about to become part of something much bigger. As she adjusted the notebook in her lap, something shifted in the room. She felt it before she saw it, the subtle change in the atmosphere, the whispers, the quiet clatter of the clerk's keyboard, the shuffle of papers. Everything seemed to quiet down just a little. It wasn't that she had made any dramatic gesture. It was just that, suddenly, her presence had become impossible to ignore. Jasmine's eyes flicked up, and she caught the first glimpse of it. The eyes, the stares, the glances that weren't quite hidden. They were all trained on her. Her fingers instinctively brushed the cross ring on her hand, the cool metal against her skin grounding her. It wasn't a loud statement, not like the garish necklaces some others wore, but in this room it became a symbol, a flag. The ring gleamed softly, subtly catching the light, but to the people around her, it might as well have been a flashing beacon. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at what she wore, at what it meant. And the disapproval was palpable. The air around her felt thick, as if the space had become charged with discomfort. Her heart beat a little faster as she scanned the room, noting the contrast. To her left, a man sat, wearing a gaudy t-shirt with the words, "I am king," written across his chest, his sunglasses resting on top of his head, as if daring anyone to question him. His presence was larger than life, his arrogance practically radiating off him. But no one in the room seemed to mind. No one seemed to care. Across from her, a woman in a blindingly gold necklace, bigger than any piece of jewelry Jasmine had ever seen, whispered loudly to her lawyer, as though she were the only one in the room. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. Not a single glance was cast in their direction. No judgment, no whispers. They were allowed to exist in the space without a second thought. But Jasmine had become a target the moment she walked in, the moment she dared to wear something that wasn't just a fashion statement, but a piece of her identity, her belief. The injustice was as clear as the cross on her finger. The disparity wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just about the cross ring, it was about everything it represented. The others wore their excess and arrogance with pride. But Jasmine, for wearing something that spoke to her deepest values, was being judged. And it wasn't just in this room. It was everywhere, in every space where people like her had to navigate a world that wanted to silence them. It wasn't just about what she wore. It was about the very fact that she existed in this room, visibly unashamed of her faith, her identity. It was too much for some to handle. It made them uncomfortable. And in that discomfort, they found a reason to question her right to be there at all. Jasmine's grip on her pen tightened, her fingers burning with the weight of the moment. She could feel the invisible line that had been drawn between her and the others. She wasn't just a spectator here. She wasn't just a woman in the courtroom witnessing a case unfold. She was a statement. Her very presence, the quiet defiance of wearing a symbol of faith in a room that didn't want to acknowledge it, was a challenge. And that was exactly why she wasn't going to back down. The more they looked at her, the more they whispered, the more determined she became to stay rooted in the truth of who she was. This wasn't just a courtroom full of strangers. It was a reflection of a system that would rather silence people like her than accept their presence. Her eyes moved across the room again, noting the disparity that existed in the space. Why was it that the flashy jewelry, the brash clothing, the overt displays of wealth and arrogance went unnoticed? Why was it that they could exist in this space without question, without judgment? But when she, a woman of color, wearing a simple cross ring, entered the room, she became the target of every pair of eyes. It wasn't about her clothing. It wasn't about the ring. It was about her presence, her challenge, her refusal to conform. Jasmine had always known that in a world like this, being herself would be a fight. But today, as she felt the weight of the eyes on her, the injustice of it all stung more sharply than ever. She didn't flinch, though. Her jaw tightened, her grip on the pen steadying her. This was what she had been prepared for. She had come here to do a job, to witness and report. But in this moment, the job had shifted. This wasn't just about the case unfolding in front of her. This was about the silent battles fought every day by people like her, the quiet prejudice that seeped into every corner of society. The whispers and stares didn't make her weaker. They made her stronger. Jasmine knew she had a right to be here, just as much as anyone else. In this courtroom, these people, they were about to learn that her presence couldn't be erased, her belief couldn't be silenced. And in the quiet of the room, as the murmurs grew louder around her, Jasmine Crockett stood firm, ready to take on whatever came next. The doors to the courtroom slammed open with a thunderous creak, and in stepped Judge Charles Hargrove, commanding the attention of the room with a presence that could freeze even the most seasoned lawyer. At 62, he was the embodiment of authority, dressed in a sharp, immaculate black robe that clung to his tall frame, his movements calculated, his steps heavy with the weight of decades spent presiding over cases like this. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly back, the strands of gray giving him an air of distinguished experience. But it was his eyes that were the most unsettling, cold, sharp, and unblinking, like the edge of a blade. As he scanned the room, the usual low murmur of the crowd silenced in an instant. His gaze was meticulous, piercing through the sea of faces, before landing on the bench where he would sit in judgment. Every person in the room knew. When Hargrove entered, the room shifted. But it wasn't the case he had been expecting that grabbed his attention. It was her, Jasmine Crockett. Sitting in the middle of the courtroom, with her back straight and her eyes focused, she seemed like any other observer. But as his eyes locked onto her, the moment stretched out, thick with tension. There was no denying it. Her presence hit him like a sudden jolt. His sharp gaze flicked toward her hand, where the cross ring gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Subtle yet undeniably there. The change in his expression was immediate. His face tightened, a flicker of surprise crossing his features, before it quickly settled into something far colder. His jaw clenched, and for a brief moment, it was as if he had been caught off guard, like something had broken through the impenetrable shield of control he wore so well. Jasmine felt it, the shift in the air, the subtle yet undeniable tension that enveloped the room. His eyes had turned on her with a coldness that could freeze a person in place. Her hand resting on her notebook involuntarily tightened around the pen. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a target the moment his gaze locked on to her. Hargrove was no ordinary judge. He didn't just make decisions. He enforced them with an iron grip. And as she felt the weight of his eyes on her, she realized that her mere existence in this space had rattled him. The cross ring on her finger wasn't just a symbol of faith, it was a challenge. To him, it was a disruption. The moment Judge Hargrove locked his cold, calculating eyes on the cross ring, gleaming on Jasmine's hand, the entire courtroom seemed to fall into a tense silence. His gaze narrowed with unmistakable disapproval, and for a brief, agonizing second, the space between them seemed to crackle with the weight of unspoken judgment. His jaw tightened and his face flushed slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to reveal the rising irritation simmering beneath his typically impassive demeanor. Then, without warning, he broke the silence. His voice was sharp, deliberate, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "That ring," he began, pointing directly at her hand, his tone cold as ice, "is not appropriate in this courtroom." Each word was chosen with care, each syllable delivered with the precision of a man who had spent decades asserting his control. "This court is not a place for personal religious displays," he continued, his eyes hardening with each word, his authority inescapable, as though he were daring anyone to challenge him. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as his words sank in. The room, already thick with tension, seemed to freeze around her. His words weren't just a critique of a piece of jewelry. They were an attack on her identity, on her very right to express who she was. The cross ring wasn't just a symbol of faith, it was a declaration, a defiance against the world that often told people like her to shrink, to hide their beliefs in the shadows. But here in this room, in the face of Hargrove's cold judgment, it felt like a threat, a challenge to the authority of the court, a challenge to the rules he had set. The injustice of it hit her like a physical blow. Hargrove, a man who had likely never been questioned or challenged in his decades of power, stood there, dictating the terms of what was acceptable and what was not, all based on his personal preferences and biases. He wasn't concerned with the law, he was concerned with control. His words, though carefully chosen, were a clear attempt to strip her of her right to believe as she wished, to express her faith in a space that, according to the Constitution, was meant to protect her rights. But his cold eyes, scanning her from head to toe, told her that in his courtroom, there were unspoken rules about who had the right to show their true selves, and it was clear she didn't fit. As Hargrove continued, the weight of the room's collective attention bore down on her. He didn't just want her to remove the ring, he wanted her to remove the part of herself that it represented. "We're here to dispense justice, Miss Crockett," he added with an arrogant smirk, his tone dripping with authority. "Not to make a spectacle out of personal beliefs. The law is not a stage for displays of religious sentiment." The words hung in the air, his attempt to justify the infringement on her rights with the kind of empty rhetoric that had long been used to silence people like her. Her fingers clenched around her pen, and the injustice burned in her chest like a wildfire. This wasn't just about a piece of jewelry. This was about Hargrove's assumption that he could dictate not just the rules of the courtroom, but the very soul of those who entered it. This was a man who believed that his authority could stretch beyond the letter of the law and into the hearts and minds of the people who came before him. And he thought he could intimidate her into compliance. But Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She wasn't going to shrink. She was ready for this fight, even if it meant facing off against a man who had spent years wielding his power with unchecked arrogance. Jasmine stood there unwavering, her eyes locked on Judge Hargrove with an intensity that burned through the tension hanging in the air. She could feel the weight of the moment, the battle for her right to be who she was, to express her beliefs without fear, bearing down on her. The room had gone deathly silent, all eyes now on the confrontation unfolding before them. She could sense Hargrove's fury building as her words pierced through the courtroom like a dagger. "Your Honor," Jasmine continued, her voice cutting through the stillness, "this ring is not just a piece of jewelry. It's a symbol of my faith, and I have the right to wear it, just as you have the right to wear that robe." Her words hung in the air, the defiance in her tone ringing out in sharp contrast to the cold, imposing authority of the judge. There was no hesitation in her, no doubt in her mind. She could feel Hargrove's eyes burning into her. but she refused to flinch. You don't get to decide when and where I can express my faith. This is America, not a kingdom. I'm not here to bow to your rules of what is appropriate. Jasmine's words were like a blow to the gut, each one striking with purpose, her resolve only hardening in the face of his challenge. The room seemed to tighten, every breath drawn in unison, waiting for Hargrove's response. His grip on the gavel tightened, his knuckles white with the anger building inside him. It was clear now. Jasmine wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to be intimidated by his power, by his years of authority, and the more she stood her ground, the more it seemed to fuel his rage. His face flushed a deeper shade of red, his eyes narrowing with contempt. Jasmine could almost see the frustration building, his authority slipping further and further from his grasp. Don't you dare lecture me on what this courtroom represents, Hargrove snapped, his voice a low growl, barely containing his fury. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Her voice remained steady, unyielding as ever. I'm not lecturing you, Judge, she said with a quiet fierceness. I'm simply reminding you of what this country is built on. The First Amendment protects my right to wear this cross, to express my beliefs freely, whether you like it or not. Her words echoed, challenging not just him, but everything he stood for in that courtroom. Hargrove's eyes flashed, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the gavel, his power slipping away with every word she spoke. Jasmine could feel his control cracking. He had expected to crush her, to silence her with his authority, but instead she was turning the tide. The injustice she had come here to expose was no longer just something she would report. It was something she was fighting for, right here, right now, with every ounce of strength she had. Judge Hargrove's fury was palpable, his inability to bend Jasmine to his will only igniting his anger further. And Jasmine? She stood taller, more defiant, more resolute than ever. This was her fight, and she was determined to win. Judge Hargrove's rage simmered just beneath the surface, and then, like a dam finally breaking, it erupted. With a forceful slam of the gavel, the sharp crack echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling off marble walls. The sound silenced even the faintest cough, the rustle of jackets, the subtle murmurs from the back row. Everyone froze. You are out of line, Miss Crockett, he barked, the tone of his voice no longer dignified but brimming with venom. His words hit the room like a slap. This is a court of law, not a place for religious theater, and certainly not for White House officials looking to score political points. He leaned forward, fingers gripping the edge of the bench so hard the wood creaked beneath him. His next words came with slow, deliberate emphasis, each one spoken like a blow. $5,000, contempt of court, effective immediately. You will pay this fine, or I will escalate further. A collective gasp swept across the courtroom. People shifted in their seats. One man near the back whispered, 5,000? What the hell? But his voice was quickly swallowed by the weight of the moment. Hargrove's face flushed crimson, his eyes flashing, not just with authority, but with something far more personal. Wounded pride. Jasmine hadn't merely challenged his ruling. She had shattered the illusion of invulnerability that he had built over decades behind that bench. And now he wanted blood. But Jasmine didn't give him the satisfaction of flinching. Slowly, gracefully, she stood. Her movements were composed, restrained, but within her, a fire burned hotter than ever. She wasn't just facing down a judge. She was staring into the face of a system that had too often used procedure as a mask for prejudice. The courtroom was utterly still, as if everyone sensed something larger was taking place. Jasmine's voice, when it came, was not raised. She didn't need to shout. It was the calm clarity in her tone that made it hit harder than any scream. Your Honor, this is not about courtroom decorum. This is about power, your power, and how you choose to wield it against belief. She took a step forward, the small silver cross on her ring glinting like a blade beneath the overhead lights. You may call it contempt, but I call it conviction. I will not remove it. I will not apologize, and I will not allow the First Amendment to be reduced to a decoration that only matters when it's convenient. Her gaze didn't falter. It bored straight through him, challenging every ounce of his authority, not with disrespect, but with righteous resolve. The judge's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His breathing was uneven now, his fingers twitching as they hovered above the gavel. He was losing control, not just of the courtroom, but of the narrative. And everyone could see it. The clerk had paused her typing. The bailiff stood perfectly still. Even the spectators, who moments ago had been restless or distracted, now watched with wide, unblinking eyes. Jasmine had turned the room. What was once a punitive gesture had now become an exposé of bias, laid bare by a woman who refused to be cowed. Still, Hargrove tried to reclaim the upper hand. This courtroom will not tolerate insubordination, Miss Crockett. You are treading dangerously close to obstruction. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He knew it was a weak card, but it was the only one he had left. Jasmine didn't blink. No, Your Honor. What's dangerous is a courtroom that punishes people not for what they've done, but for what they represent. I didn't speak out of turn. I stood my ground. And now you're punishing me for making you uncomfortable. Her words were calm, almost surgical in their precision, and yet they struck like hammers against the old walls of authority. The tension in the air was electric, charged not just with conflict, but with clarity. Jasmine wasn't merely resisting a personal attack. She was standing up against the abuse of institutional power cloaked in legal jargon. Her voice had become a mirror, and Hargrove was being forced to see the reflection of his own prejudice staring back at him. He could find her. He could threaten her. But he couldn't unsee what the room now saw clearly. Jasmine Crockett wasn't the problem. She was the reckoning. The sting of the judge's gavel still echoed in Jasmine's ears. But as she sat, calm, composed, yet burning with silent fury, something deeper clicked into place. This wasn't about a ring. Not really. It wasn't even about courtroom decorum. This was about power, about the careful weaponization of authority to stifle the beliefs of those who dared to wear them openly. Jasmine's breath slowed, but her thoughts raced. She had seen this before. Different places, different forms, but always the same core, the quiet suppression of identity under the guise of neutrality. The $5,000 fine wasn't just meant to punish her. It was meant to warn everyone watching that faith was acceptable only when hidden. And Jasmine was done hiding. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, sweeping over the very people who now watched her in stunned silence. Some in sympathy, others in fear, a few in guilt. Her gaze locked onto the man still lounging in his "I am King" t-shirt, untouched by rebuke. To his left, the woman whose necklace sparkled like a disco ball continued whispering casually to her attorney, undisturbed. No fines, no scolding, no contempt rulings. Jasmine slowly stood again, this time not to defend herself, but to put the entire room on trial. If I'm being fined for my faith, for this ring that represents something deeply personal to me, then tell me, Your Honor, she began, her voice calm, but electrified with righteous fire. Why aren't you fining the man in the back for his bold slogan shirt, or the woman with a chandelier around her neck? Her words landed like punches, not shouted but sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The courtroom shifted, unease spreading like smoke. Hargrove's face twitched, but he said nothing. Jasmine stepped forward slightly, her voice steady and slicing through the suffocating silence. If justice is blind, why does it seem like it sees my ring more clearly than anything else in this room? The tension cracked like ice under pressure. People fidgeted. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keys. Even the bailiff's brow furrowed. Jasmine's voice lowered, slow and piercing. You're not enforcing a rule. You're enforcing a bias. And the whole room can feel it. It wasn't just the ring anymore. It was a symbol of something bigger. A battle line had been drawn, not by her, but by the man behind the bench who believed he could decide which convictions were welcome and which were punishable. But Jasmine wasn't just defending herself now. She was holding a mirror to the room, to the system, to the people who had accepted this imbalance for too long. And in doing so, she shifted the courtroom from a place of silence to a stage of reckoning. The silence after Jasmine's challenge was razor sharp, the kind that carved through pretenses and left only truth behind. She didn't hesitate, didn't blink, as she stood, her voice unwavering and aimed with precision. Your Honor, if this courtroom truly prohibits religious symbols, then I respectfully request you produce the written rule stating so. Show me where it says I cannot wear this ring. Her tone was calm, but it struck like lightning. The demand wasn't rude. It was legal, factual, grounded in reason. Yet it was met with nothing. Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tense, but no words came. He shifted slightly behind the bench, clearly rattled. His fingers tapped once against the polished wood, a nervous gesture he failed to suppress. The courtroom, already tense, held its collective breath. Everyone knew what was happening. Jasmine had cornered him with the one thing he couldn't argue, the absence of law. Because if no such rule exists, then this fine is not about order, it's about control. And if you're unwilling to enforce that same control on everyone equally, then this isn't justice, it's targeted suppression. Her words echoed in the stillness, louder than any gavel. Still, Judge Hargrove said nothing. His silence was deafening. His authority, once ironclad, now flickered with doubt. The people watching knew it. The clerk knew it. Even the bailiff, arms crossed in the corner, could feel the imbalance shifting. Jasmine's voice dropped into a low, cutting cadence. So, unless you can cite that rule, this isn't about court policy. It's about your discomfort with my faith, and I won't let that stand. And just like that, the courtroom no longer belonged to the man behind the bench, but to the woman who refused to bow. And while the courtroom wrestled with the silence that followed, Jasmine knew the real battle hadn't ended. It had only begun. Now it was time to expose what lay behind Hargrove's judgment, a history of bias, selective punishment, and something far more dangerous than a gavel, a pattern. The tension in the courtroom was now suffocating, as if the very oxygen had thinned. Judge Hargrove remained frozen, hunched behind his bench, gavel clenched in one hand, like a weapon he no longer knew how to wield. But Jasmine stood tall, anchored not just by courage, but by something even more immovable, the law. Her voice sliced through the heavy air, steady and unrelenting. We are not in a courtroom where justice is blind, Your Honor. We are in a room where bias is disguised as order. And I won't sit quietly while my First Amendment rights are turned into collateral damage for your personal discomfort. She took another step forward. Her heels tapped sharply against the marble floor, a sound that now seemed louder than the gavel had ever been. Let's talk about precedent. Let's talk about the Supreme Court decision in Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus City of Hialeah, 1993. Her hand moved with precise control, unfolding a copy of the case summary she had pulled from her brief moments earlier. In that case, the court ruled that any law or action that targets religious expression without a legitimate, compelling reason is not only unconstitutional, it is dangerous. Eyes across the courtroom widened. Some nodded slowly, others looked stunned. Hargrove shifted in his chair. Jasmine pressed harder. The city of Hialeah tried to shut down a religious practice, citing vague notions of public safety. Sound familiar? She asked, voice sharp, eyes narrowing toward the bench. The Supreme Court ruled that government, any branch, including yours, sir, cannot pick and choose which religious expressions it tolerates. Not based on discomfort, not based on appearance, and certainly not based on personal bias. A quiet murmur spread like a wave across the room. The clerk had stopped typing altogether. The bailiff's posture had shifted, no longer rigid, but contemplative. And still, Jasmine continued, her tone like an incantation of truth. So I ask you, where is the compelling interest in banning this ring? Where is the disruption? Where is the harm? Because all I see is an abuse of power, wrapped in legal theater. She held up her hand again, the cross on her ring glinting under the courtroom lights like a spark that refused to die. She took a slow, deliberate breath. You didn't find me because of courtroom rules. You find me because my faith made you uncomfortable. But the Constitution doesn't protect comfort. It protects freedom. And today, I'm choosing to stand on that freedom, even if you won't. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just confronting a judge. She was holding a mirror up to an entire system, demanding it reckon with itself. And the weight of her words hung in the room like smoke after gunfire. Undeniable, inescapable. The silence in the courtroom lingered like smoke after an explosion. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Her voice, calm yet unwavering, cut through the tension with the sharpness of a blade forged in justice. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Every syllable carried the full weight of accountability. Your Honor, if what I'm experiencing today is truly how this courtroom operates, then I believe it's time we looked at your track record. The words landed with force, each one deliberately chosen, each one aimed straight at the seat of unchecked power. Her gaze was steady, unblinking, as it locked onto Hargrove. I respectfully request an investigation into your past rulings, specifically your treatment of individuals wearing religious symbols. A low ripple passed through the gallery. The tension thickened. This was no longer about one woman and one ring. This was about pattern and precedent, about whether justice had been consistently applied or quietly weaponized. Hargrove's fingers twitched. His jaw clenched tighter. His silence grew heavier with every passing second. Jasmine stepped forward once more, her presence as commanding as it was defiant. I have no interest in spectacle, Judge. I came here to observe a case, not become one. But if this court has a habit of punishing faith while ignoring louder, flashier expressions of self, then the public has a right to know. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keys again, unsure whether to transcribe rebellion or revolution. Even the bailiff looked on, not with hostility, but with the recognition that something historic was unfolding. Jasmine didn't flinch. She pressed on, her words now ringing with unshakable clarity. You hold power in this room, but that power must answer to the people and to the Constitution. I won't just pay your fine and walk away quietly. I will file a formal complaint. I will call for a judicial review, and I will ensure every judgment you've passed that hints of religious bias sees the light of day. She paused, letting her final words hang in the air like a verdict. Because if you've turned this courtroom into a place where belief is punished and silence is rewarded, then you're not just violating the law, you're betraying the very oath you swore to uphold. And with that, the room didn't just fall silent, it held its breath as if waiting to see whether the gavel would fall or whether the system itself had just been put on trial. While the courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence, Jasmine moved with the controlled precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Beneath the surface of public defiance was a far more calculated act of resistance. Tucked subtly beneath her notebook, her phone had been recording everything, from the moment Hargrove singled her out to the exact second he imposed the fine with no legal grounding. She didn't need to shout or protest wildly. She had the most powerful weapon in a battle against systemic abuse, undeniable evidence. Without drawing attention, her fingers tapped swiftly across her screen. The audio file was clean, clear, and damning. She attached it to a confidential encrypted message addressed directly to White House Chief Legal Counsel and the Deputy Director of Civil Liberties. Her message was short but explosive. Clear constitutional violation during court observation. Judge Charles Hargrove, deliberate religious discrimination caught on record. Request immediate review and internal judicial audit. Recording attached, urgent. She hit send. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but a bomb had just been dropped behind the scenes. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't smile. This wasn't about vengeance or personal vindication. This was about setting precedent, about ripping the veil off the kind of targeted oppression that had quietly thrived in courtrooms across the country under the guise of professionalism and neutrality. Hargrove's actions weren't just wrong, they were systemic symptoms of a much deeper sickness in the legal system, and Jasmine had caught it on tape in real time. Her silence now wasn't weakness. It was the stillness of the storm just before it ripped the sky apart. She glanced briefly toward the bench. Hargrove was still seated, still breathing heavy, still gripping his gavel like it meant something. He had no idea that his authority had already begun to unravel. Jasmine had sent the evidence straight to the top, bypassing local channels that could be stalled or silenced. And in doing so, she lit a fuse that wouldn't just burn through one courtroom, but through the entire judicial fabric that protected bias behind black robes. What had started as a courtroom reprimand had now become something far more dangerous. For him, Jasmine didn't come here to start a war, but now that one had been forced on her, She would make sure the world heard every shot fired. By the time the courthouse doors closed behind her, the story was no longer confined to four walls and a gavel. It had become a national reckoning. The first ripple was subtle. A 27-second courtroom recording, filmed in secret by a stunned law student in the back row, uploaded with the caption, "Judge finds WH official for wearing a cross ring. She fires back, armed with the Constitution." Then came the wildfire. Within minutes, the video was reposted by a civil rights attorney in New York, a Christian advocacy group in Texas, and a First Amendment scholar from Georgetown Law. It wasn't just trending, it was erupting. The hashtag number sign cross in court wasn't born out of PR or strategy. It was born from outrage, from awakening, from something that people across backgrounds recognized instantly. This wasn't just an overreach, it was a violation. The clip spread with blinding speed. The soundbite that went viral was Jasmine's voice, calm and piercing. "You don't get to decide when and where I'm allowed to believe. That's what the Constitution is for." By the end of the hour, over 1 million views had been logged across platforms. X, TikTok, Instagram Reels, even LinkedIn, yes, LinkedIn, became battlegrounds of commentary, analysis, and heated debate. Some posted photos of themselves wearing cross rings in solidarity. Others dug into Judge Hargrove's history, pulling public records, matching case patterns. The internet had become an investigative machine. And Jasmine, its reluctant but fearless spark. Major networks were forced to pivot mid-broadcast. CNN cut into a live segment on economic policy to run the footage. Fox News aired it twice in the same hour. MSNBC brought in a constitutional law professor to break down Jasmine's legal response, calling it a masterclass in courtroom restraint and legal brilliance. Within hours, her name began trending next to First Amendment, judicial bias, and religious liberty. Conservative circles praised her for defending faith under fire. Progressive voices applauded her for holding institutional power accountable. And in a political climate as fractured as this one, the fact that both sides were pointing to the same moment as righteous was more than rare. It was revolutionary. Meanwhile, the hashtag evolved. Cross in court became not just a phrase but a symbol, a rallying point for citizens who'd felt their beliefs policed or diminished in public spaces. Photos poured in from people across the country. Nurses wearing faith pendants at work, students holding up handmade crosses in school cafeterias, veterans in uniform with rings engraved with verses. The caption beneath many was the same: "I stand with Jasmine." What began as a confrontation inside one courtroom was now a movement unfolding in real time, visible on every device screen, in every feed, across every timeline. And yet, amid the digital chaos, one truth stood firm. Jasmine hadn't asked for this spotlight. She hadn't raised her voice for fame or fury. She had spoken because it was right. She had stood because the law was on her side. She had recorded the moment not to shame a man, but to expose a pattern. And the country responded not because she demanded it, but because they saw in her the kind of strength they'd been waiting for. By midnight, Cross in Court had trended globally, and the world was watching. The response wasn't just swift, it was seismic. What began as a courtroom confrontation had now ignited a political and legal uprising. Within hours of Jasmine Crockett's video dominating the national conversation, the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives pulsed with urgency. Representative Lila Dawson of Ohio, herself a former civil rights attorney, delivered a scathing address on live television. What happened in that courtroom was not just illegal, it was un-American. Judge Hargrove did not just fine a woman, he tried to fine the Constitution, and we will not stand for it. Her words echoed through the chamber, interrupted only by spontaneous applause from both sides of the aisle. Yes, both sides. A rare bipartisan alliance began to take form, stitched together not by politics, but by principle. Members of the House Judiciary Committee called for an emergency session. Senator Ruben Salazar of Arizona issued a formal request for the Department of Justice to open a civil liberties investigation into Hargrove's pattern of rulings, citing mounting reports of previous fines issued disproportionately to individuals wearing crosses, hijabs, and other religious symbols. His press conference was blunt and electrifying. This is not an isolated incident. This is a judicial culture problem, and Jasmine Crockett just exposed it with the clarity of daylight. Meanwhile, national and local religious organizations rose like a tide. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, National Baptist Convention, Muslim advocates, and the Sikh Coalition released a joint statement, a first in their history, declaring their unified support for Jasmine and condemning Judge Hargrove's actions as an assault on the sacred freedom to worship without fear. Their words struck deep. If the courtroom becomes a place where faith must be hidden, then justice has already been lost. The streets responded just as fiercely. Outside the D.C. courthouse, where it all happened, hundreds gathered by sundown, some in suits, others in jeans and worn sneakers, but all carrying something in common, visible symbols of faith. Cross rings, yarmulkes, headscarves, rosaries, prayer beads. One man held a hand-drawn sign, "Jasmine stood so we don't have to kneel." Chants broke out not in anger, but in insistence. Protect the first, suspend the judge. Protect the first, suspend the judge. And then came the legal firepower. The Federal Association of Judicial Integrity, an organization known for investigating misconduct behind closed doors, issued a rare public letter to the D.C. Judicial Council demanding Hargrove be placed on immediate administrative leave pending review. Their language was unprecedented. In our view, Judge Hargrove's conduct constitutes a direct breach of constitutional neutrality and an abuse of judicial authority with chilling implications for public trust in the bench. Internal emails from courthouse staff began to leak. Messages suggesting Hargrove had received warnings in the past about disproportionate enforcement on religious defendants, but had brushed them off as emotional overreactions. Jasmine, who remained silent through most of the media frenzy, issued one carefully worded statement through her office. "This moment is not about me. It's about the principle that no judge, no matter how long they've held the gavel, can decide who gets to believe and who doesn't. I stood up because I had to. Now we all must." And as the calls for accountability rose into a thunderous national chorus, one truth became undeniable. The justice system wasn't on trial because of Jasmine Crockett. It was on trial because she finally forced it to look in the mirror. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but now Jasmine Crockett was a flame the nation refused to look away from. What had started as a tense courtroom standoff was no longer just a viral clip or a trending topic. It had evolved into a symbol, a movement, a mirror held to the soul of the country. The image of her standing tall, shoulders squared, eyes unwavering as Judge Hargrove towered above her, was broadcast across every platform imaginable. The moment her voice rang out in defiance, "You don't rule over my conscience," it became a rallying cry carved into the conscience of a restless republic. And the power of it was not in its volume, but in its stillness. A woman with truth on her tongue and the Constitution in her hand. Editorials praised her, not as a political figure, but as something far rarer in modern times. A principled resistor who didn't ask to be followed, but made people rise simply by refusing to fall. Overnight, she was called the modern-day Deborah, a warrior in a blazer, the face of fearless faith. Civil liberties forums featured her quotes. College students debated her case in pre-law courses. Legal commentators dissected her courtroom arguments with awe. And yet, when reporters tried to corner her in hallways or press her in interviews, she deflected the fame with cool precision. "This isn't about me," she repeated time and again. "It's about what's been happening quietly for too long, and what we choose to do now that it's in the light." But even as her name lit up social feeds and talk shows, Jasmine stayed focused. She returned to her office the next morning, not with swagger, but with a folder full of requests from citizens, legal groups, and faith leaders begging her to keep going. Letters poured in by the thousands. A 12-year-old girl from Nebraska, who was once told to remove her cross necklace in class, wrote, "You made me brave." An elderly nun from South Carolina sent a handwritten note that simply read, "God sent you into that courtroom. Thank you for not leaving him at the door." Jasmine read each one in silence. And when she looked up, she didn't see a finished fight. She saw the beginning of something far greater. She hadn't just survived a moment of injustice. She had transformed it into a national reckoning. And as the storm outside intensified, calls for investigations, judicial reform bills, legal panels reopening closed cases, at the center stood Jasmine, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a woman who simply did what so many others had been waiting to see. She stood up and did not sit down. The machinery of justice, once slow and shielded by layers of institutional protection, now surged forward with a force rarely seen in judicial accountability. The Judicial Ethics Commission of Washington, D.C. moved swiftly, not out of political pressure alone, but because the evidence against Judge Charles Hargrove was overwhelming, irrefutable, and damning in its pattern. Jasmine's courtroom recording served as the ignition, but it was the floodgate of testimonies and internal documents that turned the investigation into a tidal wave. Former defendants stepped forward with trembling voices and trembling hands, recounting moments they'd long buried. Being fined for rosary beads, scolded for turbans, whispered to by bailiffs to hide that cross if you want leniency. One woman, a mother from Arlington, held up a citation she'd saved for years, $150 for inappropriate religious attire. Her only offense, a silver Star of David necklace barely visible beneath her collar. Then came the documents, redacted transcripts, memos from staff. A retired clerk, now terminally ill, submitted a signed affidavit that chilled even the most hardened legal minds. Judge Hargrove would flag cases during recess. This one's wearing a cross? Mark it. Take notes if they cause trouble. These weren't just anecdotes. They were evidence of a deliberate, systemic campaign of selective enforcement. A silent, sustained war against the visibility of belief in a courtroom that was supposed to be blind. Legal scholars called it one of the most blatant First Amendment violations in modern court history. Civil liberties groups compared it to Jim Crow-era respectability policing, but aimed not at clothing or race this time, but at faith. Under mounting pressure, the Judicial Ethics Commission issued a formal resolution in an emergency session. The language was sharp, clinical, and final. Judge Charles Hargrove is hereby suspended, effective immediately, due to credible and corroborated evidence of sustained religious discrimination in courtroom conduct. A full disciplinary hearing is scheduled. Further review pending possible referral to federal civil rights prosecution. It was a rare moment of institutional clarity. A direct rebuke not only of one man, but of a culture that had protected him for over 3 decades. Outside the courthouse, where Jasmine had once stood alone, thousands now gathered, clergy in robes, veterans in uniform, students with crosses, crescent moons, and prayer shawls. The mood was not celebratory, it was reverent. A man with tears in his eyes whispered to a reporter, "We've been waiting years for someone like her." Another held up a sign, "You tried to silence her. Now the whole world is listening." Hargrove, once feared and respected in legal circles, vanished from public view. No statement, no apology. His chambers were sealed for review, his name removed from active court listings. Colleagues distanced themselves. The Bar Association launched its own inquiry, and behind every action, every shift in momentum, stood Jasmine, not pushing for vengeance, but insisting on truth. She hadn't just forced a corrupt judge into the light, she had pulled back the curtain on how power, left unchecked, can become prejudice in a robe. And now the system was being forced to reckon with what it had allowed for far too long. This was no longer just about her ring. It was about restoring the dignity of belief in a place meant to serve justice, not undermine it. She hadn't planned to lead a movement. She'd only planned to tell the truth. But the moment Jasmine Crockett walked out of that courtroom, shoulders square, head high, cross ring still gleaming defiantly on her hand, she ceased to be just a woman fighting injustice. She became the spark that ignited a national awakening. Her defiance echoed far beyond marble walls and court transcripts. It spilled into living rooms, classrooms, sanctuaries, and newsrooms across the nation. She had stood alone, and in doing so made millions feel seen. And when she won, not just the courtroom battle, but the moral one, something shifted permanently in the American consciousness. No longer was the issue framed as a question of tradition or policy. It was now a question of freedom, of dignity, of whether citizens in the land of liberty would be forced to silence their beliefs just to walk into a government building. Jasmine's victory emboldened more than outrage. It summoned action. Churches and synagogues held town halls. Civil liberties groups held emergency strategy sessions. Dozens of state legislators began pushing their own localized versions of what was soon dubbed the Crockett Standard: mandatory judicial transparency regarding religious discrimination, clear protections for visible symbols of faith in public institutions, and legal channels for recourse when those rights were violated. And Jasmine didn't let the momentum stall. Behind the scenes, she organized meetings between constitutional scholars, religious freedom advocates, and bipartisan congressional leaders. She brought together voices that hadn't sat in the same room in years: progressives, conservatives, faith leaders, and even secular watchdog groups. Not because she agreed with all of them, but because she knew the only way to guard freedom was to protect it for everyone, equally. Her voice became the fulcrum. We don't win when one group is allowed to believe and another is told to hide. We win when belief of any kind can exist without fear. It wasn't rhetoric, it was a roadmap, and the country followed. The movement she inspired wasn't just about legal change, it was cultural. Media outlets ran retrospectives. Documentaries were produced. University law schools began offering full seminars centered around the Crockett case. Students wrote theses on the implications of courtroom bias and the modern evolution of the Establishment Clause. Civil rights icons called her privately, thanking her for reigniting the kind of clarity and moral urgency the country hadn't seen in decades. Jasmine, for her part, kept her feet firmly planted. She refused a book deal. She turned down speaking tours. But she did accept one thing: a seat on a new independent National Commission on Religious Freedom in Public Spaces, where she served not just as a figurehead, but as a force of legal precision and moral gravity. The injustice she faced had been real, sharp, and deeply personal, but what she built from it was bigger than any one court case. It was a grassroots engine that redefined how America viewed the boundaries between belief and bureaucracy, and while her name would forever be linked to that courtroom clash, it wasn't the confrontation that defined her legacy. It was what she built in the ashes of that confrontation: a movement that would not bend, would not break, and would never again be told to sit quietly in the back of the room. The updated regulations were surgical in detail, unapologetic in tone, and unshakable in their legal grounding. Section 1, Paragraph A, stated in bold, "The wearing of religious symbols, visible or concealed, shall not constitute a violation of courtroom decorum unless said symbol is proven, beyond reasonable doubt, to cause a direct disruption to the administration of justice." It was a reversal of decades of silence, a declaration that dignity would no longer be conditional. Training programs were immediately launched. Every judge, clerk, bailiff, and security officer in the district was now required to undergo annual First Amendment certification, focused specifically on religious liberty and implicit bias. Old handbooks were shredded. New manuals, thicker, clearer, stamped with federal legal references, were issued to every courtroom employee. The transformation was visible. At the D.C. local court, the very same building where Jasmine had stood her ground, new signage was posted at all public entryways. No longer were vague warnings about appropriate attire the first thing people saw. Instead, they were greeted by a bold, engraved plaque. "This court respects all faiths. Religious expression is protected by law." The change was more than cosmetic. It was cultural. People noticed. A woman wearing a hijab walked into court the next day and wept at the sight of it. A man who'd once been fined for a Star of David pendant now returned, his necklace in plain view, to file a motion with confidence. But perhaps the most powerful shift came not from the printed policies, but from how people within the system began to speak. Judges who had once remained silent during discriminatory enforcement now spoke openly about the need for accountability. Bailiffs asked questions in training sessions they never would have dared before. Clerks shared stories of things they'd witnessed but had been too afraid to report. A long-buried awareness had been unearthed, and now it was shaping a new judicial generation. All of this because one woman refused to remove a ring. Because one voice, calm, unshaken, armed with law and principle, had said, "No more." And now, thanks to that moment, no one entering a DC courtroom would ever again be forced to choose between their faith and their right to justice. Jasmine Crockett didn't set out to change the system. She set out to do her job. But in the blink of a gavel, she was thrust into a battle that had quietly defined the fears of thousands before her. What began as an unjust fine in a dimly lit courtroom became a catalyst for something far greater: the exposure of a hidden fault line in American justice. And in choosing to stand her ground, in refusing to shrink before authority that had overstepped, she didn't just protect her right to wear a symbol of faith, she shattered the silence that had allowed that injustice to thrive unchecked. Her resistance didn't end with a courtroom confrontation. It echoed forward, reshaping how an entire district, and soon a nation, approached matters of religious liberty in the very place where justice was supposed to be blind. What Jasmine ignited was more than a political moment or a legal precedent. It was a moral reckoning. For years, courtroom decorum had served as a shield for prejudice, a quiet tool that allowed those in power to suppress what they deemed too different, too visible, or too inconvenient. But with one recorded confrontation, Jasmine tore the curtain off that hypocrisy. Her case became mandatory reading in law schools. Professors dissected her legal argument as a model of composure under duress. Civil liberties organizations began auditing old cases, using her blueprint to uncover buried violations. A quiet revolution was unfolding, led not with riots or slogans, but with statutes and truth. Inside the DC legal system, the ripple effect was immediate and irreversible. Judges who had once operated with unchecked discretion now faced regular performance reviews for religious bias. A digital complaint portal was created for defendants to report discriminatory treatment. Backed by a task force, Jasmine helped structure herself. Faith-based advocacy groups partnered with the Office of Judicial Affairs to produce multilingual guides that helped ordinary citizens understand their rights when entering courtrooms. In just 6 months, over 24 rulings were overturned on the grounds of unconstitutional bias, all traced back to the fire Jasmine had lit.